The fire station always smelled like diesel, sweat, and the ghost of smoke. It was a smell that clung to Samuel's uniform, to his skin, to the very fibers of his being, and he wore it like a badge of honor. For 15 years, the men and women of Station 7 had been his family. They were the ones he'd bled alongside, the ones who'd held him back from running into a collapsing building, the ones who'd sat with him in the dead of night after a call went bad, passing a thermos of black coffee back and forth in the heavy silence of the engine bay. They knew his laugh, a loud, booming thing that filled the whole station. They knew his temper, quick to flare but even quicker to cool, and they knew his heart, which was about as big and open as the Texas sky. They knew him, or so he had thought. His life had been a straight line for a long time. Up at 5, a grueling workout, a shift that could be anything from a cat in a tree to a 5-alarm warehouse blaze, and then home to the little house on Sycamore Lane. He had built that house with his own 2 hands, alongside his father before the old man's back gave out. Every nail, every beam, every carefully laid tile in the kitchen held a memory. It was the house he'd brought his wife, Eleanor, to after their wedding, carrying her over the threshold with a grin so wide his cheeks had ached. It was the house where he'd rocked his daughter, Lily, to sleep in the old wooden rocking chair that had been his grandmother's, humming off-key lullabies because he could never remember the right words. Those were the good years. The years that felt like sunlight streaming through a window. They were the kind of years a man looks back on when the world turns cold, wishing he could have bottled that warmth and saved it. But marriages are not made of sunlight alone. They are made of the gray, quiet days too, the days of missed connections and unspoken resentments. Eleanor had been a city girl from Dallas, and while she loved Samuel's rugged charm and the safety he represented, the small-town life began to feel like a cage. She wanted more than the steady hum of a fire station siren. She wanted the bright lights, the career opportunities, and the social life she felt she was missing. The arguments started small, like a crack in a dam, and they grew until the whole structure was compromised. They tried counseling, sitting in a sterile room with a woman who took notes and nodded, but they were speaking 2 different languages by then. Samuel spoke the language of commitment and duty, Eleanor spoke the language of ambition and self-fulfillment. When the divorce papers came, Samuel felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. He didn't fight it. He couldn't. Fighting was his job, but this was a battle he had no heart for. The divorce was brutal. It was a process designed to dissect a life, to put a monetary value on love and a legal definition on loss. The custody battle for Lily was the worst part. It was like having his heart put through a wringer. Eleanor had a better lawyer, a shark from the city with a sharp suit and sharper questions. He painted Samuel as a man married to his job, a man who spent his nights sleeping at the station and his days exhausted, a man unfit to be a primary caregiver. The stories they twisted, the hours they exaggerated, the love they turned into neglect. Samuel sat in the courtroom, his knuckles white on the wooden railing, and listened as his own life was rewritten as a tragedy of his own making. He lost temporary custody. He was allowed visitations, supervised visits at a county facility where the walls were beige and the toys were broken, where a social worker watched his every move with a clipboard and a dead-eyed stare. He would see Lily for 2 hours every Saturday, and when he watched her walk away with her mother, he felt a piece of himself die each time. And then, like a snake in the grass, Pete slithered in. Pete was Samuel's cousin, the son of his mother's brother. They had grown up together in the same small town, but where Samuel had shouldered responsibility, Pete had dodged it. Pete was a charm merchant, a man with a permanent smile and a handshake that always felt a little too slick. He could sell snow to an Eskimo, as their grandfather used to say, and the only thing he ever truly sold was the truth for a lie. He had always been envious of Samuel. Envious of the respect Samuel commanded, the home Samuel had built, the family Samuel had seemed to effortlessly deserve. Jealousy festered in Pete like a splinter, and the divorce was the infection that let it spread. Seeing Samuel vulnerable, seeing the town's golden boy brought low, it was an opportunity Pete could not resist. It wasn't just the kick of seeing Samuel brought down a peg. It was more than that. It was a deep, sour need to prove that he, Pete, was just as good, that the world had simply played favorites. If he could drag Samuel into the mud, maybe he wouldn't feel so soiled himself. It started in whispers. In the barbershop, over cups of stale coffee at the diner, in the aisle of the Piggly Wiggly. At first, it was just mutters, the kind of rumors that float around any small town like dandelion seeds on a summer breeze. Did you hear about Samuel? They were soft at first, phrased as questions. Heard things got ugly with him and Eleanor. Then they grew teeth. Pete would lean in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, his face a mask of fake concern. I hate to say it, I really do, given his mother is my aunt, but I saw the court documents. You wouldn't believe what it says. The man has a gambling problem. He lost their savings. It's a crying shame. Poor Eleanor had to get out to protect the little girl. It was a beautiful lie, as all the best ones are, rooted in a splinter of truth. Samuel had gone to a poker night a few times, a cheap game with the boys from the station to blow off steam. Pete took that and built a cathedral of deceit. The whispers grew into a chorus. He abandoned his kid. Didn't even put up a fight for her. That one hit the hardest. The legal battle Samuel had fought, the money he'd spent, the sleepless nights he'd endured praying for a different outcome, it was all rendered invisible by a man who had nothing better to do with his time. Then came the worst one. He stole from his own mother. Took her retirement money to pay his lawyer. Can you imagine? The man is a snake. It was a complete fabrication. Samuel had paid for the lawyer with a second mortgage on his house, a burden he was still struggling under. His mother, a kind woman with a gentle smile, was his fiercest defender, but she was also bedridden with arthritis and rarely left her house, making her an easy target to slander. She was the heart of the family, and Pete's lie was designed to attack Samuel where he was most vulnerable, at the very core of his honor. The town slowly and methodically turned its back on him. It was a feeling like walking into a room and having all the air sucked out. The friends he'd known since kindergarten, the men he'd considered his brothers at the station, they started to avoid his gaze. They'd fall silent when he walked into the room. He'd hear a snippet of conversation, see them huddle, and the laughter would die like a switch had been flipped. The whispered accusations were never to his face, they were the most cowardly kind, a whispering campaign designed to isolate and suffocate. He was left to walk the streets of his hometown, the place he had sworn to protect, feeling like a ghost in his own life. People he'd saved, people whose children he'd pulled from burning cars, would cross the street to avoid him. Their judgment was a physical weight on his shoulders, heavier than any of the gear he wore into a fire. At the station, the atmosphere curdled. The men he'd trusted with his life started looking at him with suspicion. The chief, a gruff man named Wallace who had been a firefighter for 40 years, called him into his office. The room was small and cramped, filled with dusty plaques and a sad-looking fern. The chief didn't mince words. "Samuel, there's a lot of talk. Talk that's making its way up the chain. There are allegations of theft. Of moral turpitude. The board is asking questions. They're concerned about the image of the department." Samuel could only sit there, a caged animal, his pride stripped away. "Chief," he started, his voice hoarse. "They're lies. All of it. You know me. You've known me for 15 years. The chief sighed, a long, weary sound. "I know, son. I know. But I can't control what people say, and I can't control what the board does. They're talking about a suspension. Maybe worse. I'm in your corner, but I can only do so much. You need to get this sorted out. Get this sorted out." As if it were a simple task. As if he could just walk up to the town and shout the truth into the wind. He was a firefighter. He knew how to kill fires, not how to fight rumors. This was a different kind of inferno, an invisible one that was consuming everything he had built, burning his reputation to the ground. The blackening of his name was a slow, agonizing process, and he felt utterly powerless to stop it. He went to see his mother one night, needing a refuge from the constant barrage of whispered insults. She lived in a tidy little house on the edge of town, surrounded by the rose bushes Samuel's father had planted for her decades ago. She was in her rocking chair, her hands gnarled but her eyes sharp. She had heard the rumors, of course. In a town this size, a thing like that travels faster than a prairie fire. "Son," she said, reaching out to pat his hand. "These people are fools. They don't know you the way I do. They see what they want to see." But even in his mother's embrace, the poison had seeped in. He could see the worry in her eyes, the way she tried to hide the tremor in her voice. The rumor had hit her just as hard. To be accused of being stolen from by her own son? It was a humiliation she didn't deserve. Samuel didn't know what to do. He was a man of action, a problem solver. He could extricate a person from a twisted car wreck. He could formulate a rescue plan in 60 seconds flat. But this? He was completely lost. He was drowning in a pool of other people's malice. The nights were the worst. He would lie in his empty house, the silence oppressive. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Pete's smug face. He saw the calculating glint in his cousin's eyes at the last family gathering, a gathering where Samuel had felt so out of place, a leper in his own family. He had wanted to grab Pete by the collar, to shake the truth out of him. He had pictured it 100 times, the satisfying crack of his fist against his cousin's jaw. The thought was a dark, tempting comfort. He imagined the look on Pete's face when he realized his game was up. He imagined the town turning their backs on Pete the way they had turned on him. It was a fantasy that brought him a sick sort of peace. He had dreams of revenge, a vague, shapeless thing that burned in his gut like acid. But he was a practical man. He knew that confronting Pete physically, giving into that rage, would only prove Pete's narrative. It would make him look like the volatile, unstable man Pete had described. And it would be his word against his cousins, and the town was already predisposed to believe Pete. The real damage wasn't just the loss of his reputation. It was the loss of his identity. A man's name is everything in a small town. It's the history of his family, the measure of his trust, the foundation of his life. And Pete had poisoned it. He began to feel the isolation deep in his soul. It was a cold, hollowed-out feeling. He stopped going to the diner, because he couldn't take the looks of judgment and pity. He stopped going to the hardware store, because the owner, a man he'd known for 30 years, would look at him as if he were a common thief. The silence that followed him everywhere was a constant reminder of his fall from grace. His friends, the ones he'd thought were his rocks, were gone. They had chosen the easy route, the path of least resistance, which was to simply believe the rumor because it was easier than asking questions. The sting of their betrayal was a constant companion, a low, throbbing pain that was always there, just under the surface. There was one moment, one specific night, that broke him. It was a cold Tuesday in November. He had just finished a 12-hour shift, a grueling shift that had ended with a car wreck that was especially gruesome. He'd had to cut a young woman out of her vehicle, holding her hand while she screamed in pain, his face streaked with her blood. He went to the grocery store to buy some milk and bread, just wanting to get home and collapse. He was standing in the aisle, staring blankly at the boxes of cereal, when he heard two women talking at the end of the aisle. They were his neighbors, the Hartwell sisters, two elderly women who always had a fresh pie on their windowsill. They didn't see him. "It's just a shame," one of them was saying, "about the firefighter. I always thought he was such a nice man. But Pete, you know, he's family. He told me that Samuel stole his mother's money and just abandoned that little girl. It's a sign of the times, I tell you. You just can't trust anybody anymore. I heard he's in trouble at the station too. Might even get fired. Serves him right, I suppose. The truth always comes out in the end." Samuel stood there, frozen, the cold air from the freezer section creeping up his legs. The words hit him like physical blows. Serves him right. He hadn't done a single thing wrong. He had done everything right. He had been a good son, a good father, a good firefighter. And this was his reward. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He left the basket on the floor and walked out of the store, the bell on the door jangling behind him. He got in his truck and drove to the edge of town, past the city limits sign, until he reached a stretch of empty highway under a vast, starry sky. He parked the truck on the shoulder and just sat there, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. He had never felt so utterly and completely alone. The rage, which had been a dull ember, erupted into a roaring inferno. He wanted to tear something apart. He wanted to hurt Pete the way Pete had hurt him. He wanted to stand in the middle of the town square and scream the truth until his voice was gone. He wanted to make them all pay. Every single one of them who had judged him without a shred of evidence. But the rage was a hungry flame, and it burned through him until all that was left was a cold, aching emptiness. He realized, sitting there on that empty road, that revenge was a trap. It wouldn't restore his name. It wouldn't bring back the trust he had lost. It would only make him look more guilty. He thought about his daughter, Lily. He thought about the way she used to look at him, with pure, unadulterated trust. He couldn't bear the thought of her seeing him as some vengeful monster. He couldn't fight back with fire, because that's what they expected. Pete was a master of chaos, of creating a storm. Samuel knew he had to be the opposite. He had to be a rock. He had to be a calm center in the midst of the hurricane. He had to fight back with something more powerful than anger. He had to fight back with the truth. It was the only weapon he had left, and he was going to wield it with surgical precision. That night, back in his silent house, Samuel started to plan. He was a firefighter, a man trained to stay calm in the face of chaos, to think clearly when the world was burning around him. He applied that same logic to his own life. The answer came to him in the stillness of the night. It wasn't a physical confrontation. It wasn't a yelling match. It was a paper trail. He was a man of order and records. He thought of the divorce hearings. They were a matter of public record. He had transcripts. He had receipts. He had the official court documents that detailed every step of the legal battle. And he had Pete. He had the history of Pete's own life, a life that wasn't exactly clean. He had the ammunition. He just needed to use it in the right way. The first thing he did was submit a request for a comprehensive set of public records. He wanted the transcripts of the custody hearings, the financial filings that had been submitted to the court, the official documentation that detailed the custody arrangement. It took a few days, but he received a thick manila envelope in the mail that contained his entire life, laid out in black and white legal jargon. He went over it with a fine-tooth comb, highlighting the facts that contradicted Pete's stories. He found the very document that showed he had not abandoned Lily, but had in fact fought ferociously for her, spending his life savings in the process. He found the statements from the social worker, which stated he was a stable and loving parent. He found the financial records that showed the money for the lawyer had come from his own equity, not from his mother's savings. The truth was right there, in black and white. But it wasn't enough to just have the truth. The truth had to be presented in a way that was irrefutable, undeniable. He knew he had to put it in a format that couldn't be ignored. He remembered a computer class he had taken years ago at the local community college, a class that had taught him the basics of creating a website. It was a simple skill, but it was the perfect tool. He poured his heart and soul into that website. He didn't just paste the documents, he organized them. He created a timeline. He put the date of the custody hearing, the date of the accusations, the date of the financial filings. He scanned the receipts, the bank statements, the court transcripts. He included audio recordings from the divorce hearings that had been publicly available, snippets of his own testimony and the judge's rulings. He wrote a simple, clear narrative, devoid of emotion, that laid out the truth. He titled it, simply, The Truth About Samuel. He didn't mention Pete by name. He didn't have to. He said, "Someone in this town has been spreading lies about me. Here are the facts. You can read them for yourself. I have not abandoned my daughter. I have not stolen from my mother. I have not committed any crime." The tone was measured, factual, almost clinical. It was a man presenting evidence to a jury. He concluded the page with a single, powerful line, "Read. Then decide who you believe. I will still help you put out a fire tomorrow even if you hate me today." It was a line that embodied his character, a commitment to his duty even in the face of profound betrayal. It was his code, the very core of his being. The day he released the website, he sat in his living room, his finger hovering over the send button on his email. He had collected every email address he could find in the town directory. He had the contact info for the chief, his neighbors, his friends, the church group, the mayor, everyone. He took a deep breath and pressed send. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the hum of his computer and the frantic beating of his own heart. He had just thrown a stone into a very still pond. He didn't know what the ripples would bring. He didn't know if it would work. He felt a surge of terror, a fear that he had just made things worse, that he had just given Pete even more ammunition. He went to bed that night, tossing and turning, his mind churning with anxiety. The next morning, he woke up to a buzzing phone. It was a text. From a friend who hadn't spoken to him in months. "Sam. I saw the website. I'm so sorry. I should have known better." Another text. Then another. The emails started to pour in. They were from neighbors, from old schoolmates, from colleagues at the station. The tide had begun to turn. He turned on his computer, his hands shaking slightly. He saw the analytics for the website. It had been viewed hundreds of times. He read the comments, a flurry of shock, apology, and anger directed at the anonymous liar who had poisoned the town. He watched. The truth, for the first time in months, was out there. It was hanging in the digital ether for the whole world to see. The weight that had been crushing him for months started to ease, just a fraction. Over the next few days, the change was palpable. He went to the grocery store, and instead of avoiding him, people came up to him. They shook his hand. They apologized. Some had tears in their eyes. "I'm so sorry, Samuel," one woman said, a woman who had known him since he was a boy. "I don't know why I listened to them." He accepted their apologies, offering his hand and a tired smile. He didn't revel in it. He didn't feel triumphant. He just felt a profound weariness, a sadness that it had come to this. The damage had been done. The trust was broken, and while it was being mended, the cracks would always remain. It was the fire station that felt the most like a homecoming. He walked into the bay, and the men fell silent. For a moment, he thought they were going to turn away again. But then his partner, a burly man named Miguel, came forward. He walked right up to Samuel and clasped his hand. "Hey, brother," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "We got your back. We never should have doubted you. It was a stupid thing to do. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Samuel nodded, his throat tight. He had seen Miguel cut a man out of a burning vehicle with his bare hands. He had seen him run into a burning building without a moment's hesitation. Seeing him humbled, seeing him apologize, it meant more than Samuel could say. It was the repair of a brotherhood. But the victory was hollow. The deeper he got into the website's analytics, the more he read about Pete's reaction, the more the vengeful fire was replaced by a profound disquiet. Pete was in trouble. The town's outrage, once directed at Samuel, was now turned squarely on Pete. It was a feeling that was just as isolating, but from the other side. Samuel didn't feel joy. He felt a strange, aching emptiness. He had wanted the truth to be known. He had wanted the world to see what Pete had done. But seeing the fallout, the vitriol directed at his cousin, it didn't feel like winning. It felt like he had become the very thing he hated. He had exposed the truth, but in doing so, he had also exposed a man's life to ruin. He had exacted his pound of flesh. The day the judge's ruling came, it was a cold, rainy afternoon. Lily was being returned to him. He could see her through the glass partition of the courthouse, a tiny figure clutching her mother's hand. The temporary custody order was overturned. The judge, a stern woman with spectacles, had read the website. She had seen the transcripts. She had seen the facts. She declared that Samuel was a fit parent, that the allegations were unfounded, and that it was in the child's best interest to be with her father. Samuel went down on one knee, his heart pounding out of his chest, and opened his arms. Lily ran to him, her little arms wrapping around his neck, her small body shaking with sobs. He held her so tight he thought he might break her. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the sweet scent of her shampoo, and for the first time in a year, he felt whole. He had his daughter back. The hole in his heart was finally starting to fill. That first night, she was home in the little house on Sycamore Lane. He had made her favorite meal, macaroni and cheese with hot dogs, a simple childhood comfort. They sat at the table, and the silence was golden. He looked at her across the table, this miracle of a child, the reason he had fought so hard. But his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about Pete. He had just learned, through a grapevine that was now once again abuzz with gossip, that Pete's life was falling apart. His wife, a woman named Brenda, had seen the website. The world had seen the evidence of her husband's lies. The shame was too much for her. She left him. She had taken the kids and gone to her sister's house in Oklahoma. Pete's business, a small landscaping company that had barely been scraping by, was going under. People wouldn't hire him. They wouldn't even look at him. The condemnation was swift and absolute. Samuel saw Pete a few days later. He was coming out of the hardware store, and there was Pete, sitting alone on a bench in the town square. He looked like a ghost, hollowed out, a shadow of the charming, confident man he had been. His eyes were red-rimmed, his clothes disheveled. He was staring at the ground, utterly defeated. Samuel felt a powerful surge of something. It wasn't the satisfaction he had expected. It wasn't revenge. It was a profound and unsettling pity. He remembered the fantasy he had had, the fantasy of punching Pete, of seeing him ruined. And here it was, in the flesh, a living, breathing consequence of his actions. But there was no triumph in it. The punishment far outweighed the crime. He had not just exposed a liar, he had destroyed a man. He had taken away his family, his livelihood, his very identity. The feeling that washed over him was a cold dread. Was this what revenge was supposed to feel like? It felt like a sickness. He walked past Pete without a word. He wanted to just ignore him, to let him stew in his own misery. It was what he deserved, wasn't it? After everything he had done, didn't he deserve this? The internal conflict was a war. The man of justice, the man who had been wronged, whispered that Pete had made his own bed. But the deeper voice, the voice of his conscience, whispered something else. It whispered about mercy, about the fact that everyone falls short, that everyone makes terrible mistakes. It whispered about the nature of judgment, and how it was a heavy burden to bear. It whispered about the way the town had turned on him, and how it was now turning on Pete, and how sick and senseless that cycle of condemnation was. It was the very same poison that had been used to destroy him, and he was an accessory to it being used on someone else. He had used the truth as a sword, and he had cut deep. He went to the fire station that evening, his heart heavy. A call came in. A residential fire. The address pinged in the system, and Samuel's blood ran cold. It was Pete's house. The house on the edge of town, the one he had bought when his business was doing okay, the one Brenda had decorated with flowers. The fire, a kitchen fire that had gotten out of control, was raging. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. Single-story residence, fully involved. Reports of a man trapped inside. Samuel froze for only a second. Every instinct, every ounce of his training, kicked in. He was a firefighter. It didn't matter who was inside. It was his job to save lives. The pettiness of the past, the bitterness, the desire for revenge, it all evaporated in the face of the immediate, primal need to act. He got in the truck, his heart pounding, a new, different kind of fear flooding his system. He wasn't afraid of the fire, he was afraid he wouldn't get there in time. He was afraid of the guilt he would carry for the rest of his life if he let his personal feelings stop him from doing his duty. The siren screamed through the town, and Samuel said a silent prayer, a plea for the power to do what was right, no matter how hard it was. It was a moment of profound clarity. They arrived to find the house engulfed in flames. The heat was ferocious, pressing against them like a physical wall. Thick black smoke billowed into the sky. The neighbors were gathered in the street, their faces pale with shock. "He's inside," someone yelled. He went back in for a picture of his mother. Samuel was out of the truck before it had even fully stopped, pulling on his gear, a heavy coat, a helmet, an air tank. He looked at the inferno, and saw his own house, the one he'd built, the one he'd lost, reflected in the flames. He saw his own fear, his own vulnerability. He looked at his chief, who gave him a grim nod. Samuel grabbed a hose and charged. He worked his way through the hellish heat, the smoke stinging his eyes, his movements guided by pure instinct. He found Pete in the back bedroom, curled up on the floor, clutching a burnt photograph frame. Pete was barely conscious, coughing, his face black with soot. The flames were licking at the doorframe, threatening to engulf the room. Pete looked up at him, his eyes wide with terror and, beneath it, a flicker of recognition. It was a look of pure, unadulterated despair. Samuel, he rasped, his voice a scratchy whisper. "Help me. Please. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Samuel didn't hesitate. He didn't think about the lies. He didn't think about the custody battle. He didn't think about the accusations. He just saw a man, a terrified, broken man, who was about to die. The firefighter in him took over. "Hold on to me, Pete. Don't let go," he yelled, his voice booming over the roar of the fire. He hoisted Pete over his shoulder, the weight of him, the weight of all their history, pressing down on him. He carried him through the blazing hallway, the heat searing his skin through his gear, the flames consuming the house around them. He stumbled out into the cool night air, dropping Pete to the grass as other firefighters doused the flames. Samuel collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, coughing out the soot. He looked down at his cousin. Pete was coughing, crying, gasping for air. He was alive. He had pulled him from the jaws of death. The moment was surreal. He had just saved the man who had tried to destroy him. The man who had taken his daughter, his reputation, his life. And he had done it without a second thought. He had done it because it was right. He had done it because he was a good man. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt something far more complex, a deep, abiding sense of peace, mixed with a profound sorrow. He had been given the opportunity to let Pete die, to allow the universe to exact the ultimate punishment. No one would have blamed him. But he hadn't done that. He had chosen the harder path. He had chosen mercy. Later, after the fire was out and the paramedics had checked Pete over, Samuel visited him at the station. Pete was sitting in the back of an ambulance, a blanket around his shoulders, looking lost and broken. The paramedics had cleared him, but he was in shock. Samuel walked over to him. He didn't say a word. He just handed him a small paper bag. It was a meal, a simple sandwich and a juice box. Pete looked up at him, his face a mask of confusion and guilt. "Why, Sam? Why did you save me? I don't deserve it. I was so wrong about you. I was so jealous, and I tore you down, and you still saved me." Samuel looked at his cousin. He felt the cold night air on his face, the ghost of the fire's heat still on his skin. He saw the raw, honest agony in Pete's eyes, a pain that was far greater than any he had ever felt. He didn't feel the need to gloat. He didn't feel the need to moralize. He felt a deep, weary compassion for the broken man before him. "I forgive you, Pete," Samuel said, his voice quiet but steady. "I forgive you. But forgiveness doesn't mean trust. That you have to earn." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked away, leaving Pete alone with the weight of his own actions, and Samuel walked to his truck and got in. He sat there for a long time, staring at the smoldering ruins of Pete's house. He thought about Lily, asleep in her bed at home, dreaming of dolls and butterflies. He thought about the town, a place he was starting to feel like he could belong to again. He had taken his revenge. He had exposed the truth. He had destroyed Pete's life. But he had also saved him. He had carried him out of the fire. And in that act of mercy, he had found something he hadn't been looking for. He had found a strange, powerful healing. The anger, the bitterness, the thirst for revenge, it was all gone. It had been washed away by the flames. All that was left was a quiet sense of peace, a profound understanding that justice and mercy were not opposites, but two sides of the same coin. He had wanted to see